Welcome back to the Hack Upstate YouTube live stream. We are about to kick off office hours for week 7, module 4 for JavaScript. If you guys have any questions, please go ahead and post them in Slack now. And we'll be here from 6:30 to 8:30 working on problems. And hopefully your questions will start coming in soon. Okay, so we have a question about factorialize here. This is a free code camp challenge under the basic algorithm scripting section. And basically what's happening here is it's not telling us that we can use 5 exclamation mark. That's just saying that the shorthand notation is typically 5 exclamation mark. So if this were in typical math, if you're doing algebra 2, it would be written out as 5 exclamation mark. But here what factorialize wants us to do is probably set up some kind of loop where it takes a number and that loop is going to run a certain number of times and then it's going to factorialize the number that we pass in. So let's get started here. What we're going to do, first of all, is we can just console log out our number and see that 5 is coming out. So we see that 5 right here is getting passed into the number right here. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up a for loop, and we're going to say for, and what we're going to do is we're going to start this for loop at at 1. So we're going to say 1 is equal to I. Well, I is less than or equal to the number, because if we look at the example over here, 5 factorialized starts at 1 and runs all the way through 5. So we're going to say, well, I is less than or equal to num, I++, and then we have to do something inside our loop. So what we're going to do is outside of the loop, we're going to say let fact sum equal 1. And the reason why we want to start it at 1 is if we start it at 0 and multiply 0 times something, of course that's going to be 0. We don't want to multiply 0 times anything. So in our fact sum, we are going to multiply equal by I. We're going to multiply equal by the number that we're on in the loop. And then instead of returning num, we're going to return fact sum in here. And so let's go ahead and run that. And we got it. All right, so we have a request to do find the longest word in a string. This is also in the basic algorithm section. So what we're going to do here is finding the longest word in a string. Obviously, we're going to use a loop because we need to loop over each of the words in the string. But in order to loop over it, how do we loop over something that's a string? A string, what are we looping over? We need to split up that string so that we can look at each individual word in the string. And in order to do that, we're going to use split. So what we're going to do is we're going to say const split array is equal to str.split. And Free Code Camp is helping us out here, and it's saying that a string that identifies the character or characters to use in separating the string, right? So we have to tell it what we want to split it out on. So what we're going to say is, hey, go find any space, and whenever you find a space, make that the first element in the array. And then go until you find the next space, and when you find the next space, make that the second element in the array. So what we can do is, to make sure this is working, we're going to console log out our split array. And our split array now has the, quick, brown, fox, jumped. So it is breaking up that string for us, which is great. So we're going to write a for loop. And we could write our for loop with a for let I equals 0 while I is less than split array dot length I plus plus. But we're going to be a little fancy here. We're going to use a for in instead. So we're going to say for let word in array. In split array. And now we can console log out our word. And what do we get is all these indexes. Okay, so that's helpful. That's iterating over it. But instead of in, let's use for let word of split array. And now look what we get. The quick brown fox. So we can totally rewrite this as for let I equals 0 while I is less than the split array dot length I plus plus, and then in here we could say let word equal split array bracket I, and then console log out our word. And I'm just going to comment this out for now. And if you notice down here, we get the same output, but which is cleaner or easier to read? Do you prefer writing out the I equals 0 and then getting the length and then getting the index and going back to the array? Or we can use this shorthand notation here that goes, hey, just iterate through the array, and for every item in the array, make it equal to word. And now when we console log out our word, it does the same exact thing. So this is the more traditional way of writing it, but we can take advantage of this shorthand in JavaScript and use this let word of array. So I'm going to comment this out, and we're going to keep going on this method. Totally achievable on either method. But what we want to return here is the length of the longest word. So what we're going to say is we are going to say let longest length equal 0. And what longest length is going to do is it's going to keep track of what we're on, right? So we're going to say, how do we get the length of a variable? We're going to do dot length, right? The length of a string. So this loop is running, and we get 3 as the first one, and that's because the has 3 letters in it. And then we're going to go on to quick, and quick is going to have 5, 5, 3, 6, so on and so forth, right? So what we're going to do in here is we're going to say if the word that we're on in the array dot length is bigger than the longest length, then we are going to set our longest length equal to the word length. And then instead of returning our string length, we are going to return longest length instead. So now that we're in here, we're going to go ahead and run that, and we got it. So let's go ahead and talk through that a little bit more. So why do we need this if statement in the first place, right? Why can't we just say longest length is equal to the word length? Go ahead, run through the array, and then set the length of the word to the longest length. Well, if we run this, we lose a bunch of tests over here, right? We got a bunch of fails. And the reason that's happening is we are going through and we're going, okay, the length is 3. All right, great. So longest length is now equal to 3. Quick, okay, the longest quick has a length of 5. So longest length becomes 5. We completely override the 3, and in this case, that's what we want. We get to brown, longest length becomes 5, it already was. Now we get to fox. Well, fox is back down to 3. So it's going to go, oh, we don't care, we're just going to set longest length to 3 now. So the code, the way it's written, is longest length, by the time the loop is done running, is always going to be equal to the length of the last word in there. So what we do is we say, hey, only set longest length if the word that we're currently looking at, if the word on the loop that we're in is longer than the longest length, the longest word that we have already found. And if it is, that's great. Go ahead and set in it. Otherwise, go ahead and return longest length once we get through every single word in that array. And it's important not to put this return in our for loop. So if we put return longest length here, and we comment it out, and we run it, we get one more, but for the most part, it doesn't run. Why is that? All right, so what it's doing is it's going, all right, we split our array up, and our array is now, each element in the array is an independent word. And we're going to say, okay, if the word length is greater than the longest length, which is what we want, set the longest length. But as soon as it gets here, it goes, all right, before I go to the next word, go ahead and return. Well, return stops. Return breaks the loop and goes, you're done. Great. Which is why in this case we got a green check mark, because Google, the first word in the array, happened to be the longest length. So we want to be careful about where we put our returns, because returns break loops. They go, nope, you're done, you returned it, we don't need to keep working on that. So we're going to take that back out here, we're going to put our longest length back in, and hopefully we still get our green check marks. Feel free to keep the questions coming in Slack. Okay, so we have a request to do a function called divide. And divide, the reason we want the function is we want to make sure that, one, the numbers we're passing in aren't empty and they're not equal to 0. So what we're going to do is we're going to do our function divide, and we're going to take two parameters in our function divide. The first one will be num1, the second one will be num2. And then we're going to write some code down here, console.log divide, and we'll do 8 as our first number and 4 as our second number. So when we're writing in here, we would just, to get started, do a basic return num1 divided by num2. And in our console, out comes 2. So our divide is working great. All right. Now we want to think about how a user might use this function. So what happens if we pass in 0 as one of our numbers instead? Well, we get infinity. I don't think that we want infinity. So what we're going to do is we're going to come up here and we're going to say if num1 is equal to 0, or num2 is equal to 0, then we are going to return divide error. Else, we can return our numbers. So now we get divide error, which is a much more friendly thing than infinity. And if we put this back and we put in our 4, we get 2. Now this is an interesting note. What do we know about returns? Returns stop functions, right? So what we can do is we can come down here and we don't actually need our else. We can put this, fix our indentation, and notice it's running fine and we get 2 coming out. And if we put back our 0, we get back our divide error and we don't get infinity. And that's because we're hitting this return and the return is done and the function's finished running. Now, this is a personal preference thing. I personally want to put an else in here. And the reason why I want to put in the else is the computer doesn't care because the computer hit the return, it has the divide error come out, and that's it, we're done. However, for me, it's much easier to read this code to say, okay, if the things are true, then we're going to return divide. Else, now as a programmer in my head, I'm going, okay, this is only going to run if this is not true. Like I said, you can take out the else and it will still behave as expected because the return is going to stop the execution. But in this case, I think it's easier to put in the else and see that this is only going to run if these are not true. So let's go in here. Let's get fancier with our divide. Let's put in divide 8 divided by cat. Well, now we get NaN. Well, we should get NaN. You can't divide cat by 8 or 8 by cat. That doesn't work. So we're going to add in another condition here. We're going to add in an or, and we're going to say if num1 type of is string, or num2 type of, and I forgot we need our equality operator, right? We're checking to see if it is equal to string. And I think I actually flipped these. I believe type of you do in reverse. And so that's a mistake I just made, right? I thought it was num1 type of. It wasn't. The way I can find that is opening a new tab and typing in type of JavaScript. And I know this is really tiny. I'll blow it up in a second. But we get some documentation from MDN. And MDN reminds us that, hey, when we console log, we do type of in the beginning and then the value that we want to check. And what it's going to return is number if we pass in a number, or string if we don't. I'm sorry, string if we pass in a kind of string. So let's go back here. So now we have 8 divided by cat. We get our divide error coming out. We can go in here, we can change it back to a number, and we still get our number. All right, but this is fine, we get divide error, but sometimes it's better to be more specific. So let's go in here and say divide error, numbers can't be 0. And then we're going to come in here and we're going to do an else if. And we're going to take all of this code in here, and we're going to say else if type of num1 equals string or type of num2 is string. Now let's do a new else if and say return divide error again, so we know where the error is happening. When you have a lot of different code, it's easy to get lost in where that error is getting thrown. So being specific and saying, hey, this is still a divide error, but let's go in here and let's say parameters must be numbers. And so now when we change this back to test, we get divide error parameters must be numbers. So let's go one step further. Instead of checking to see if it's a string, really all we want to do is check to see if it is not a number. So if we go in here and we say 8 divided by true, we get 8. Well, we don't want that. We want another error in here. So what we're going to do is instead of specifically checking for a string, let's check to see if it's a number. And we're going to say if type 1 is not a number, or if type of num2 is not a number, parameters must be numbers. And notice down in our console, it's already beaten us to the punch, and it says divide errors parameters must be numbers. And if we put in some string there, we get the same error. But if we put in a number, out comes the number we want. So sometimes it's easier to check for what we don't want as opposed to what we do want, and vice versa. So in this case, we just made it clear, hey, if the thing coming in is not a number, go ahead and say, make it a number. Fix my indentation, and I'll be waiting for more questions in Slack. Okay, so we have a question on the smiley face challenge over at Khan Academy. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So they want this code is working, right? And we know it's working because in Khan Academy it's returning it over here. And let me blow that up for you guys. Sorry about that. All right, so what they want us to do is they want us to make this a little bit more object oriented. So if we want to make two smiley faces for some reason, we could do that more easily. So it's saying start off by creating a smiley face constructor that stores center X and center Y properties. Okay, so instead of this face object here, we're going to convert this face object into a constructor. And in order to do that, we are going to say function smiley face, and smiley face is going to take two properties, right? And these are own properties. We're going to define these properties right in the constructor. So we're going to say center X and center Y. And we are going to come in here, and don't forget to close our curly brace. And then we're going to say this dot center X is equal to center X. And this dot center Y is equal to center Y. And the reason we need to do that is when we construct our smiley face in a second, the center X and center Y is going to get passed in as parameters. But what we need to do is to tell our smiley face that we want to save these values. Because otherwise they'll get passed in as parameters and JavaScript will go, all right, well, you're not doing anything with them. So in here, we're basically saying, hey, take those parameters and store them inside this object that we're going to create. All right, so we made our smiley face constructor that stores center X and center Y. Let's see. If you want to define a function, you should use. Okay, so they do it a little differently. They want us to do a var smiley face is equal to a function with center X and center Y. And then they want a semicolon at the end. They're a little bit more picky with this. So, all right, great. We passed it. We converted this face object, which is just a boring old object, into a constructor that's taking center X, center Y. It's storing those values as own properties into smiley face and using that. Great, so let's keep going. So they're saying, okay, now that we've made our constructor, use it to make the face and pass that face into the draw function. All right, so we're going to delete out our old face because we're no longer using that. And down here, we're going to say var face obj is equal to a new smiley face. And that new smiley face is going to take in a couple parameters. So let's do, I'm going to actually back out that code to see what the parameters were before so we don't get something weird. All right, they were both 100 and 100. So we're going to say smiley face 100, 100, put in our semicolon, and Khan Academy is even telling us here, hey, you're making the new face object, we should probably delete out this code so we don't forget about it. So we're going to delete that. We passed it, but let's talk through what's happening here. We're making our new constructor right here for smiley face, and it's taking center X, center Y. But this code never really runs until we get down to here. And when we get down to here, JavaScript is going, all right, great. You want to put this in face object. What do you want to put in face object? Oh, you want a new smiley face. Let's go look at what a smiley face is. So we're going to come up here and it goes, oh, smiley face is a function. This must be a constructor. Okay, what do you want center X and center Y to be? So we tell it down here, 100, 100 is center X and center Y. And it goes, great. Now in our constructor, what do we want to do with that? So we say center X is 100, and it goes, oh, okay, you want to store 100 in this object, in this constructor. Great. And you want to do the same with Y. Awesome. All right, so now we made your constructor. Here is your object that is a type of smiley face, and we're going to store that in face object. And now, when we come down into our draw smiley function, we see our face object. And when we go and we actually draw the circles, it has access to face object center X, which is awesome. That's what we want. And in theory, I'm not sure if this is going to work, but it does. If we change our center X, it shifts the whole smiley face over because we changed it here. So I'm going to keep going in the stream here, and I'm going to go through to step 5. If anyone has any other questions, feel free to ask them in the Slack channel, and I'll keep going. All right, so now we made our constructor function. We made our draw smiley use our new function using that constructor. So in this step, it says turn draw smiley into a draw method on the smiley face object prototype so that you can call it on any smiley face instance, right? So what they're saying is, great, we made our object that has center X, center Y, but we also want to convert draw smiley over. So the reason why we want to do that is because when we make smiley faces, no matter how many smiley faces we make, we want to make sure that each one of them has draw smiley built into it. So what we're going to do is we're going to go in and we're going to define this on the smiley prototype, because anything that is made as smiley as the parent, as the inheritance, we also want them to be able to draw smiley. So if we did it in here and we had something that was the prototypical function of smiley face, we would run into problems. It wouldn't have access to draw smiley. So that's why we're going to do it in here. We're going to say smiley face dot prototype dot draw, and then we're going to define what that is, right? So we're going to say is equal to, and Khan Academy is very aggressive and filled it all in for us, which is quite all right. And we're going to cut that and paste that into here. And now we're going to delete out our old draw smiley. And now it's saying what's draw smiley. I don't know what draw smiley is. We deleted that. What we want to do instead is say, hey, on our face object, we want to draw. And I think they want something a little different here. Let's take this out. And we got an error. And the error is face obj was used before it was defined. So here's our face obj, and it's defined down here. But in our prototype, it is now referencing face obj. We don't want it to reference face obj. We want it to look at this center X. So we're going to say this center X and this center Y, because we want it to reference these values instead of having something passed in. And we're going to keep going here. And for some reason, I have a bad feeling that this isn't right, but we're about to find out. Could be completely wrong, and this could be the right thing to do. Let's see. All right, we got it. That was the right thing to do. So what we're doing is we're saying, all right, we're going to make this new thing, this new constructor called smiley face, but we're not going to use it yet. Don't worry about it. And we're going to make it so those new smiley faces have a draw prototype. But you know what? We're not going to worry about that one either yet. Okay, now we're going to make our face object. Now we have to worry about it. All right, new. We're going to make a new smiley face. We're going to pass in 100 and 100. That's going to come up here to the center X and the center Y. And we're going to store both of those parameters in the properties of smiley face, the own properties of smiley face in this case, because it's set in the constructor. All right, great. We didn't use prototype draw at all yet. That's fine. And the computer would be just go, all right, I'm going to ignore that until you tell me to draw something. Now we come down in here and we go, oh, we're going to draw. So what are we going to draw? We're going to go up here on face object. Face object is a type of smiley face. Well, smiley face has access to draw because it is in the prototype of smiley face. And now we're going to come in here. All right, fill 255234, great, no problem. This dot center X is a little interesting. What we're saying is we actually want center X is 100, right? But there's no access to center X if we did it in here unless we use this. So what this is doing is it's saying for this particular smiley face, what is the center X? So we could do something interesting here, right? Let's copy and paste this. Hopefully it's not going to get too mad at me for doing this. And let's change this to 300, right? So now all of a sudden we have a new smiley face and we're drawing it. So the first time we say dot draw, and you know what, just to be clear, we're going to change the names on those. So the first face we draw, we're saying 100, 100, and draw it. So when we draw these circles out, it's going to use 100 and 100. Now we make a new smiley face, and when we make the new smiley face, center X in that particular object becomes 300. 300 is great, and we don't care about the 300, we're just storing it in face object 2 dot center X. Now that that's in there, now when we say draw, it goes great, we want to draw it again. All right, go ahead and run this with the fill. All right, now we want to draw this circle. What's the center X on face object 2 dot center X? And that center X happens to be 300. So what we just did is we made two smiley faces, but because we're using the this property, it's going to reference the 300 here because the 300 comes up here to the center X in the constructor. That center X is getting passed down into the own properties, and we're storing it in this. So because it's stored in this center X here, we can access it in this dot center X here. And because there are two more steps, I have a bad feeling that Khan Academy is going to have us repeat that, but let's see. So I'm going to take out our second smiley face. We don't need that. Khan Academy didn't ask us to do it. And it's saying, okay, it wants a speak method. And that's going to make the smiley face talk. All right, so we are going to come in here and we're going to say, hey, smiley face is going to get a new prototype. We're going to spell smiley right. And we're going to say dot prototype dot speak. And speak is going to be a function that takes a parameter. So let's just call that text. And in our prototype, it is going to use text. And the text is going to take a message, so that's going to be our text there. And that's not a great name for the variable because this text function is already something that Khan Academy has defined for us. So instead of calling it text, let's call it incoming message. And now in here, we're going to say incoming message. And the X, I'm gonna guess is this dot center X. I'm not quite sure what they want here yet. So let's do this dot center Y, and let's leave it there. And we're gonna put a semicolon at the end. And it's saying, great, you made this thing called speak, but speak isn't going to get used until we tell our object to speak. So we're going to say face obj.speak. And it says, okay, you've defined speak, but speak needs a parameter. Speak needs what we want it to say. So we're going to say, hello world. And if you notice, our hello world showed up right on our smiley face. By the way, feel free to interrupt me here if you guys have any questions on this as we're going along. Feel free to ask. Otherwise, I'm going to power through to step 5. we're going to make more smileys. It's almost like we did this before I got to this step in Khan Academy. And so the point of this step in particular is for us to show why we want to do prototypes. So instead of copying and pasting this code over and over again, there's a lot happening in draw. There's some stuff happening in speak. So what we can do is we can come down here. We're going to copy this code. And we're going to say, hey, there is now a face object 2. And face object 2 is a smiley face. But we don't want to draw back on face object, the first one that we created up here. We want to draw a second one. Now, you're going, okay, well, why didn't that change over here, right? We created our second smiley face. Well, it actually is running. It's actually running right on top of it. So we notice up here that Khan's given us a little warning, and it's going, hey, you got to change your coordinates so you can see it. So instead of changing the x coordinate, let's change the y coordinate. And that showed up, and that's fine, but we want to drop it down a little bit more. So let's drop it down to 300. And it's saying that it wants hello world to be a different message. So we're going to say hello world 2. Now, Khan Academy didn't do a great job here because look, hello world 2 is up here. Well, what did we do? We said, hey, on our first face, say hello world, and on our, then go ahead and make our new smiley face, call it face object 2. Go ahead and draw out our face object 2 at these new coordinates that we defined in our constructor. Great, that's happening. Now go back to the original face object and say hello world 2. Overwrite the first thing that we said here. That's not what we want to do. So when we're working with objects, it's important to remember what object we're working on. So we're going to say face object 2.hello world, and all of a sudden, because in our speak function, we use the center x and center y in the object, it's going to be using 100 and 300, and it's going to speak out hello world 2. So now we have our two smiley faces. We've completed all the steps. Let's finish the challenge, and we got our little congratulations. So if you guys have any questions on this in particular or why we did something a certain way, feel free to ask in Slack. If you want me to keep going and do the flower grower in Khan, we can also do that. Or we can shift back over to free code camp. All right, keep the feedback coming in Slack, please. All right, so we got a question to go over parse in. And so I'm glad that Karen asked this question because I have our divide function that we were just working on a little a little earlier. And so if we're in this console log here and we say, hey, divide 8 divided by 4. Well, we put 8 in a string here, right? So we get our divide error parameters must be numbers. Well, this is a number, but to JavaScript, that's not a number, that's a string. So let's try and do parse int on that. So we can say, hey, I know 8 is coming in as a string, but we want to actually say, hey, take that 8 as a string and make it into a number. So I'm just going to play around up here a little bit before we dive into implementing that. So what we're going to do is we're going to say console.log, and we are going to say parse int, and we are going to parse int as num1. And notice what comes out here is 8. Now, if we console log before we parse int num1 out, we also get 8. But FreeCodeCamp is kind of jipping us a little bit here. They're just saying 8 and 8. That's not actually what's happening. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the big boy console. And by big boy console, I just mean the Chrome inspect element. Getting all kinds of fun resizing here. So I apologize for, I don't know quite what I did. Okay. So what's happening here is if we look at our console, we have 8. But if you look closely, that 8, oh, I'm realizing I'm blocking it by my web camera. Sorry. Let's pull this up a little bit so you guys can see it. All right, so we have 8, but 8 is blue. And then we have 8, and 8 is not blue. Well, why is that? That's because the first time we console log it out, that 8 is coming out as the string. But when we console log it out the second time, 8 is coming out as a number. And so the way we can prove that is if we console log out our type of num, we see string. And if we console log out the type of parse int, we see number. So what parse int is doing for us is it is converting num1 that's coming in as a string into a number. So let's do this. Let's, instead of type of, let's say const num as string is equal to num1. And in here, let's do const num as num, which is a silly name, but that's okay for now. So we put it in 2 different variables. So now let's console.log num as string plus 2. And console.log num as num plus 2. And you notice what happens here is we're passing in 8. So 8 came up and it goes, oh, okay, num is string. We're just copying that from num1. Num is string. Okay, 8 plus 2. Well, because it's a string, it's going to concatenate out. And we get 82. Well, we don't want 82. We actually want 10. We're trying to add 8 plus 2. So that's why we use this parse int here, because now all of a sudden we're saying, no, it's not 8 as a string. I want you to turn 8 into a number. And so that's what we did. Is we said, okay, num is num. Now this is not equal to 8 as a string in quotes. This is now equal to 8 as the actual number. So when we say 8 plus 2, we actually get 10 coming back out. And that's what we want. So we're going to take it a step further. This is the basic of parse int, and that's cool. But we're going to check and see, all right, well, if we pass in 8, we have to check to see if that is a valid thing. So what we're going to do is use another function, and I'm not sure if FreeCodeCamp has covered this yet or not, but it's a super valuable thing to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, if num1, and we're just worried about num1 right now. We can make this apply to num2 in a second. We're going to say, is num1 is NaN? Is num1 not a number? And in this case, we're going to console log num1 is not a number, else console.log num1 is a number. And what comes out here, we say num1 is a number. So what that's doing is it's saying, hey, 8, even though it's a string, we recognize that it is a number, and it's a number hiding out there. But if we change this to cat, we get num1 is not a number. So what that's doing is NaN is just checking to see whether the thing in the string is a number. Now we can also change this back to 4, and it goes num1 is a number, or we can put it in quotes and it will recognize that it is still a number even though it's in quotes. But nan is not actually operating on num1. It's just returning whether or not we can parse out essentially the thing that's in num1. So what we're going to do is I'm going to think about where I want to put my code, right? Because we want to check if num1 is 0. That we still want to do. So what we're going to do up here is we're going to say is if num1 not, so we're going to do the reverse. So if num1 is nan, not, so flip it. So what this is basically doing is saying console log is a number. So let's test and make sure that's doing what we want. And what we want it to do is if it is a number that's coming in, we're going to try and parse it out. But we'll do that next step. So num1 is a number. 4, even though it's in quotes, is a number. Let's change that back to cat. And cat doesn't console log anything out. And if we change that back to 8, num1 is a number. And if we put in 8, num1 is still a number. So we are going to say if num1 is actually a number, we are going to num1 is equal to parse int of num1. And out comes 2. But if we put this in quotes, it still works. And we know it's working because we can change it to 16 and our answer changes. So what we're doing is we're saying, hey, check to see if the thing you're passing in is actually a number. So we can go in here and take this whole thing and put it up here now. And then delete out our else if in there. So now 16 is working. We can say cat, and we now get, hey, we checked this, and the thing you passed in, it wasn't a number in a string, and it wasn't a number by itself. So we're going to put this error out. And we're also going to go, all right, we can put 8 back in, and that works. And we're going to put 16 in here. And so what we're doing is we're actually parsing 16, but because 16 is already a number, it goes, yeah, sure, we can do that. So let's move our code back in here, and let's check for num2, and then we'll do the same thing for num2 in here. And now we can make this a quote, and it still works, and we can change the value, and that still works. Or we can delete that out, and that works. Or we can put in a cat, and interesting. So what did we want to happen there? We wanted our divide error to come out, right? So what we said, okay, check to see num1. Num1 is a number. So that is true. So we came in here and we said, hey, parse it out. We don't want this to be an or. We want this to be an and. So what we're going to do is we're going to say if num1 is a number and num2 is a number, then go ahead and parse them out. Otherwise, give our divide error. So I know this is tricky because this is saying if it is, this function is saying is the number not a number? And then take the reverse of that and say not. It would be much easier to say, is there a function called isNumber as opposed to is this not a number? But the joys of JavaScript, JavaScript does not have a function to check to see if it is a number. It only has a function to check to see if it is not a number. So we check to see if it is not a number and then do the inverse of that. Little tricky to wrap your head around, but we did the AND operator here because we want to say, hey, we want to make sure that num1 is a number and num2 is a number. And if it is, try and parse them out. Otherwise, give our divide error. And then once we have that figured out, we have them parsed, we're going to take our num1 and our num2 and check to see if it's 0. And if it is 0, go ahead and return our divide error. Otherwise, go ahead and do the math out. So if we put 0 in quotes here, we still hit our divide error, numbers can't be 0. If we put this as an else if, that wouldn't work. So instead, we separate it out as two separate if statements. We say, first, let's take care of the string. And if the number's coming in as a string, let's go ahead and make that string into a number. If the string we're passing in can't be turned into a number, then go ahead and give the error that parameters must be numbers. If we can parse those two numbers out and all goes swimmingly, then check down here to see if those numbers are 0. If those numbers are 0, go ahead and give the divide error. Otherwise, do the math and return them out. If anyone has additional questions on this, feel free to ask, or any other additional problems, I am watching in Slack. All right, guys, it's coming up on 8 o'clock. If you guys have any more questions, feel free to post them in Slack. I'm going to be around for probably 5 more minutes. I'm happy to stay until 8:30 unless if there are more questions, but unless any more come in by 8:05, I'll probably end the stream. So if you have questions, post them in Slack. I'm happy to stay until 8:30 if you guys have them. Thanks. All right, guys, one final call for questions before we call it a night. Feel free to post them in Slack. Otherwise, we will get this weekend kicked off. Okay, so we have a good question here on how do we loop through a string. And if we go back to an assignment we did just a little bit earlier, remember how we used split and we split the array to find the longest word? Instead of using split and passing in a space, what we're going to do is we're going to split on no string whatsoever. So let's see if I can jump back to the find longest worded string. Okay, so here's the assignment that we had, and they were passing in the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. And when we did our split on an empty space, it returned the as the first element in the array, quick as the second element in the array, etc., etc. But let's see what happens if we take out this space. So we're just going to say, hey, split on an empty string. And when we console log out our split array, we have the T, H, E, and then the space, and then Q, U, I. So what that's doing is that's splitting the string into an array on on just nothing. So what we're doing is we're kind of tricking split and we're saying, hey, make an array out of every single letter in the string. So now that we're doing that, we can loop over it the way we wrote the traditional for loop here, or we can use our fancy let word of variable of array, right? And so if we come down here and we console log in here instead, and we console log out word, and I'm going to change word to letter. And in here, I will console log out my letter. We will see that every single letter gets printed out in our console log. So now we're looping over it and we have our letter and we can do whatever we want from that. Last call for questions. Otherwise, we will wind down at 8:15. All right, guys, we're gonna wrap up this office hour session. If anyone has any additional questions, not just in the next 15 minutes, but at all during the weekend, feel free to post it in the CIC students section in Slack. Otherwise, you guys have a great weekend. Enjoy Jake as the next instructor. And I will see you guys in a couple weeks from now. Thanks. See ya.